All right, we're rolling.
So as I said, part of where I'm coming from, I grew up in South Dakota, and coming here to Minnesota, it was a curiosity to me. I just wanted to kind of understand, what are some of these references that are in Minnesota. And part of my upbringing then, my dad was a Vietnam vet, and my friends always thought he was Rambo growing up because, he was a hard man. And then my mom was kind of the complete opposite. She reminds me of Carolyn Ingalls from Little House on the Prairie. So she was this big softie. And they overly nurtured me, so they messed me up from my childhood because they gave me a wondrous gift, imagination. And so that's kind of, and I knew that I was weird as a little kid because in fourth grade, we had typewriters at the time, and I typed up an assignment for my fourth grade teacher. She was beautiful, and I was going to impress her. And I did a mashup, and this is just indicative of who I am. I did a mashup of the Odyssey and the Book of Revelation because in my weird little fourth grade brain, I noticed they both took place on Greek islands. And I was like, well, that's awesome. It's like the Book of Revelation. I looked up where Patmos was, and it was like, you can see my cover here. That was my artistic ability. And I knew that Patmos was in, a Greek island. And so I was like, wow, wouldn't it be cool if Diomed and Odysseus landed on the place where the apocalypse happened? I was like, what if there were Apollons there? And so I put all that together. I don't know what my fourth grade teacher would have been thinking of me. But it was the beginning of me wanting to do kind of this mashup. And so from an early age, I like to find common ground with things. And so that's tonight, when we look over at the boards that I have up there and where we're going to go, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Minnesota mythology, the Minnesota monsters from some other cultures. But when I put it in my books, what I wanted to do was find that common ground. So I didn't want to just put it up by itself. I wanted to say, hey, look, these people have it, these people have it, these people have it. So maybe we're a little bit more connected. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from with this. And you can see, my background for this. I've had kind of a obsession since I was a little tyke. So you can see the hairless one there. That's me. There I am a couple years later because I was like, I gotta go back, take me back. And this took me, through my adult life. And my wife, is the one that has to take me places now. And so you can see here, this is in Nova Scotia. There I am at the statue of Glooskap. And so, the rest of my adult life, I've still had kind of a fascination with other cultures. Specifically, in this book series, Anishinaabe culture. And so that's kind of where I've been. So I've gone on a road trip just because, you can read, but you kind of want to experience it too. So my wife and I, we flew out to the East Coast, and I drove back the Seven Fires, exodus, migration. So that's kind of where I've been. So I'm not a history professor. I was telling other people I'm an English teacher. And I just like to go down rabbit holes and see what's down there and kind of explore. So that's me. And it's always for the reason of just having a good story. So again, if you're a history professor out there, my apologies. I get worked up. I look for a fun story. Okay, now along my way, I think when I was in Michigan visiting with I think he was Potawatomi, if I remember right. I was talking to him about the Seven Fires migration, and one of the things that was bothering me in trying to understand it and get it accurate for my book, every stop that I made between Minnesota and Nova Scotia, they all had different versions of the story.
What is it? What are Seven Fires?
The Seven Fires is, I got it coming up. Can I wait for that slide? So I'll do it then. And so when they had different versions of the story, and I asked him, it's how do you reconcile this? And one of the philosophies that he kind of came up with is well, they're all true. And I was like, that can't be though. I'm an absolutist, and I was joking on that one. I'm not at all absolute. But what he was talking about then is all these he looked at religion from around the world, and if you don't understand the wheel here, it represents different things, and so even different ethnicities is represented on that. And so what their philosophy is we should be looking at the common ground rather than what separates us. And so I heard that philosophy, and I was like, oh, that's cool. So that's what I wanted to do with my kind of young adult fantasy series, if I'm gonna like put something in the book, I want it to be something that's rooted, but also that has kind of like cross-cultural connections too. So that's, I don't know, I'm a flake, but that's what I aspire to, you know. All right, so I'll introduce the novel a little bit. So my new story, The Fire Handler, I kind of described that one. It's a classic, you know, young adults versus the monsters kind of story. And so in that regard, you know, if you've watched Netflix Stranger Things, you have this cast of young people. You know, Stephen King had a series where it was like, you know, in the book It, he had a bunch of young people dealing with it. If you've read William Kent Kruger, some of the mythos that he brings in, those are all things that were kind of like intriguing to me. So what I did with this though is, you know, writing a fantasy book, you know, like you make up this completely fictional world with fictional monsters and fictional people, and I wanted to kind of do the same sort of thing, but just set it in the real world. And so what I did then is, this is what I would describe as a fantasy series, because it's got monsters, you know, and I'm a reasonable adult, you know, but if it was true, then I've got it set up in the North Woods, and so that's kind of uniquely Minnesota mythology. And then where I put it, and those of you that kind of came in at the last minute when we were talking about it, I put it in the real world that Joseph Nicollet took me to. So Joseph Nicollet, when he was exploring, he was going up the Mississippi, you know, river to find the headwaters, and he found this spot where it was, well, I'll read it to you in a little bit. I'll just shut up, I'm jumping ahead there. Okay, so I'll read that little excerpt to you because that's right out of real life. So I'm just gonna read the back cover real quick and kind of give you an idea of what this book is about then. So this is The Fire Handler, and the back of it, in big bold letters, says there's something lurking in Lake Manitou. All right, so that's the start. Okay, so here's what it says in the book jacket. Born to Wapa Asabakashi, 15-year-old Lily Weber willfully rejects the ways of her Sioux and Chippewa ancestors and models herself after the Christian teachers of the Sacred Heart Indian Mission. But when she returns home for the summer of 1897, she finds her childhood home at Lake Manitou threatened by corrupt businessmen willing to do anything to claim the land, and by darker forces from legend and lore. When a hero arrives in the form of Father Jean-Nicolas Guérin, a mysterious Jesuit priest who knows the dark secrets of her family, Lily begins a journey that will challenge her understanding of good and evil, reality and myth, and duty and love. The Fire Handler is a modern fantasy set in the old forests of Minnesota, where Anishinaabe, Ochetisacoan, Norse, and Christian lore crash together upon the rocky shore of Lake Manitou, where an ancient evil slumbers in the heart of Hiawatha County. So that's the kind of the premise of the book. So that's the Fire Handler. And my main character then, you know, Lily, I'll explain kind of like where she came from. So how did I discover my main character? And I think we were talking about this one too, that the nonfiction comparison standard that we were mentioning. And so I had a bunch of research also on the Battle of Sugar Point. And I was reading the story. You could see some of the headlines here. There was this, on Leech Lake, there was this historical battle, kind of considered to be one of the last conflicts. And in the middle of this story about the Anishinaabe versus, you know, a United States force, there's this story about, you know, they were shooting from both sides of the channel, okay? So it was just, all heck was breaking loose there. In the middle of this fight, this young Native American girl just paddling through the middle of it, you know, paddling to beat hell. And I was like, who is she? Why was she there? Where was she going? You know, what was so important that she would have put her life, you know, because she's just going right through the middle of the battle. It was like a 3-day battle. And so that just intrigued me. So that's where I kind of imagined like who she was and what she was all about. But the other thing that I did with this, again, with me wanting to have kind of carryover, is I was also, that's me with the, you can tell this is an old Polaroid because we used to have like photo albums where things would wear out. And so that's me right there. And then that is my great grandmother, Lily. And so when I was looking for inspiration, I realized that, you know, she would have been around in Minnesota to have experienced this time period. And so for me, it was kind of like, wow, I'm gonna wrap my, because I only got to know her for a few years, right? And so for me, it was an opportunity to kind of wrap my brain around what that time period was like And then as a character, she's going to see the decades kind of change. By the time she gets to that Yahoo in the early 80s, like what would she be thinking looking back on all these things? So that's kind of where my main character really came from. Now, when I decided to turn this into a fantasy series, one of the things that gave me trepidation was like how to do this properly. Because again, I've been studying mythology, Native American mythology in particular, for a lot of my life, but I don't bring that to the game. I'm not an indigenous author. And I already explained how when I started to teach the Native American literature standards and nonfiction standards, at Maple River we'll have a small minority every once in a while, we'll have somebody with some indigenous roots, and they were completely unaware of their heritage. And when I was out promoting and writing and things like that with the other book series, which again has several of the main hero characters were either Dakota or Ojibwe, I was surprised how little mythology was known even in community. My fear though was the whole cultural appropriation thing, where you're stealing something for yourself. And so what I wanted to do then, because I remember the 70s, I saw this TV made for movie, The Manitou, and it was just like this horror fest that had no connection or anything. They just stole the monster name, and they didn't do anything to really I don't know. And so what I decided I wanted to do then is the concept of cultural amalgamation, where I try to bring these different facets together, find that common ground. Okay, so as I've explained already, and you can kind of see that on the boards too, in just the different colors, what I wanted to do is what is Minnesota? What cultures would kind of represent Minnesota? And so in that regard, you can see I picked those 4 different areas. And so if I could find something where there's some common ground, that would get me all worked up, and I would want to put that one in there. And so that's where we'll be going tonight. So when we look at the myths and the legends, I'll kind of touch on all 4, so we'll kind of look at how you can see these stories in all 4 areas. The Oceti-Sakowin, otherwise known as the Sioux, the Anishinaabe, otherwise known as the Chippewa. I put European paganism, sorry Viking fans, but that old Norse mythology, because the Vikings went everywhere, so they spread their influence to a lot of different cultures, and then Judeo-Christian as well. And now here's your answer for what is the 7 fires. And so that was one of the things that, again, drew me to my big, 3,000-mile trip from Nova Scotia back to Minnesota. So we flew out and rented a car. That's how, my wife is awesome, so that's how good she is to me. So you can see then what I'm going to be doing is in the series, I'm going to be telling a 7-book series. So that's part of what I'm trying to do. And the reason I'm doing the 7-book series is because it's based off of what happened with the 7 Fires migration. So they began on the eastern seaboard, and then they found 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They found these 7 different places that they ended up migrating to. And it was, this is why I went on the trip to just okay, what do you think this is all about? What's up with this? Because what would lead them to it? You can just believe in a very boring way that they just migrated because, okay? But in their mythology, they migrated because they were led to certain special places. And the things that led them to these special places, they would find cowrie shells, otherwise known as mealy shells. They're like this little white tropical shell that's not native to anywhere near here. It's like a South Pacific snail. And they would find these things on the islands where they're supposed to go next. And so they moved to Montreal because they found the shells there. And then what next? Well, we're supposed to keep going. There's supposed to be 7 stopping spots. So they would send their young guys out, the hunters, say, okay, go look, check out islands, okay? And then they would go find the next one, and then they'd bring everybody with. And then they would go out to the next location. And so this big epic story then led them to Minnesota. Now, again, I love the epicness of that tale because there's a little bit of paranormal influence in it. So I love that. So that's one of the things I wanted to do. And then the other aspect about it is this was far out. Depending on where you read the story from, because again, I've read like, probably 20, 30 different versions of the same thing. The wording's always a little bit different. And for me, I was like, why is it all different? imagine an Anishinaabe elder asking Christians to explain denominations, right? Okay, so I was like, okay, I got you. So the telling's a little bit different. You're all, okay. So in that regard, though, they talked about there's going to be 7 time periods. And the story was they got this prophecy from the future. And the prophets from the future told them what was going to happen over the next 7 time periods. Now, at the reference to being fires, I was all like, what does that mean? And some, like Anishinaabe scholars, will make the timeline like 1,000 years long. And others will be shorter. But when I looked at the timelines then, what's going to be important in my story, and it was because of the Joseph Nicollet book. My Joseph Nicollet book, he was an expert on Halley's Comet. And he showed up on the plains when Halley's Comet showed up in 1835. And so I was like, oh, wouldn't that be cool if that was like some sort of like sign, if that was the fire? So it's like a generational thing, because how often does Halley's Comet come around? Every 75 years. And so I just fictionally then decided to go with that one. So it's kind of a fun little, you look at, and remember my Grandma Lily? That kind of gets me right to that 80s, doesn't it? Where you kind of get to that time period where we're in the last fire. All right, so that's kind of the 7 fires. Does that explain it well enough for you? Kind of what it is? Okay, all right. And we can double back on any of this stuff. Now, this is what I was talking about, the road trip. And so the Anishinaabe then began kind of in the Nova Scotia area. That's where they received the prophecies. And then you can see Montreal to Niagara Falls to Detroit to Manitoulin Island to Sault Ste. Marie. And number 5, that's when they first encountered European explorers. So anything before that, do we have any like tangible evidence for? No, so that's kind of the most recent one. And then you can see then they spread out. And there's some controversy, even within the community, of like, where is the 7th stopping place? Because some Anishinaabe are like, oh, that is definitely Madeline Island. And others are like, no, it's Duluth. And then others are like, it's Mille Lacs. And then there's another faction that just kept going west. And they ended up all the way into the Rockies. And so that's what I mean when you're talking about beliefs sometimes. You'll have things kind of split up, and that's kind of what I had to kind of work with. All right, so the next phase, how am I doing for time, by the way? Okay, 23 minutes. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't going to keep you too late here. So as I kind of go into the next phase of this presentation, what I kind of incorporated into my story then is, I was like, okay, what myths can I use then? Which are the ones that I can find that common ground? And so that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. I've got them kind of over there on the board. So we'll just kind of take a look at kind of how I incorporate it and what is behind some of those myths. So I'll take a little break from the presenting and I'll read you an excerpt so you can get kind of a flavor for the book. All right, so this is chapter 17 of the book. So in this story then, my young character, Lily, her brother was just taken to the boarding school system. Now, she sees things a little bit different than everybody else. As a teacher, I've seen the puppy dogs in my life, the kids that just want to please the teacher, right? Their tails will wag and they'll just do anything you want. You could spoon anything at them and they'll just take it, And so my main character, Lily, is that type. She's a pleaser. And so when she gets sent to a boarding school, is she going to be like honor student that's going to like, yeah, her brother's not like that. And so he's kind of on the other side of things, because looking back on this time period, it should give you the heebie-jeebies a little bit. And so she doesn't see it that way though, does she? She's the one kind of spooning it up. And her brother was just taken from her. This is her first kind of like introduction into the adult world and how it works. So she's waking up from, after being like kind of backhanded by, she's trying to stop him from being taken away, and that was not her place in the world. So this is her waking up, and this is where we're going to start to go into some of the mythology. So this is Under the Willow. Pain throbbed from the base of Lily's skull all the way to the backs of her eyes. When she opened her lids, the blinding light overwhelmed her, bringing a torrent of vomit. Choking, she rolled to her side and up onto her hands and knees. As soon as it was expelled, her arms gave out and she collapsed onto her side. Where's McGeesy? Painted gray boards came into focus. I'm not on the street where I fell. She turned her head slightly, peering through her eyelashes, until she realized the object was a white railing. Her numb arms moved, revealing she was covered in blankets. What have I done? Lily surrendered to the pain for a few minutes, closing her eyes and taking deep breaths. The silence of her surroundings told her she was nowhere near downtown Split Rock. Finally, she forced her eyelids open again. Beyond the white railing, she saw a heap of green that focused into the long fronds of a massive willow tree. Surrounding it, a manicured lawn stretched out between short brick walls. Past the tree, the tops of the homes of St. John could be seen. I'm at the convent. Her heart jumped for a moment when a figure in a black slouch hat stepped out from behind this willow tree, but only to lift the curtain of fronds. Like her father, he wore denim, and his hair was pulled back into a ponytail. His frame was even similar, but he was half of her father's age, with scaled boots and tattered pants. Once he lifted the curtain of fronds, Lily could see an old white man sitting in the metal chair. The younger man closed the curtain of foliage, and both figures disappeared. Am I hallucinating? Approaching footsteps sounded so loud that Lily winced, swallowing another round of vomit. Afraid, she closed her eyes. Oh, darling, we need to keep fluids in you. Let me wipe off your chin. A wet rag passed over her chin. One of the nuns. Keep your eyes closed, and I'll help you sit up so you can get a drink, the woman said. And a moment later, Lily felt hands reaching under her armpits. Two women then, but still she didn't open her eyes. The change in posture caused her to see spots, even with her eyes closed. Once the world stopped spinning, she opened her lids again, slightly, to see the robes of two nuns. Where's Sister Inez? She went down to the train station with your mother and Father Garrett. Nothing about the statement made sense, but Lily forced her mind to work through it. What happened to McGeesy? How long have I been here? What day is it? It's Monday, almost noon. You took quite a blow to your head, and each time you wake, you vomit and pass out, one of the nuns replied. She waved the other way. While we've got you awake, let's get some chicken broth in you to help you recover your strength. It's been 2 days? Lily stayed conscious for the entire bowl, and even drank a bit of juice. Thank you. We brought you out on the porch because it was cool and allowed you to be ill without making a mess. I didn't mean to be a burden. Nonsense. You were known to us before Sister Inez brought you here. The nun smiled and gave her shoulder a squeeze. Rest your eyes, Lily. Your mother will be back soon, hopefully with some good news about your brother. Lily moved, her cheek now against a soft pillow, and then heavy steps walked away. Keeping her eyes closed, she pictured the blacksmith shop, with her unconscious body in the street and her brother still in the cage. McGeesy, I'm so sorry. The Jubilee had certainly ended by now, leaving the town quiet. She opened her eyes, the town a distant blur of shapes and colors in the valley below. Why can't I focus? She blinked, focusing on the big willow in the front yard. Then, a pair of legs dangled from the porch roof. McGeesy? Her heart leapt, but the legs belonged to a young woman, not a boy. The young woman only wore a nightgown and turned her body so that her bare feet caught the spaces in the trellis, and once she put a foot on the deck railing, she dropped to the ground. Lily gasped at how similar the young woman was to herself, except with short cropped hair. Their eyes locked. If you want to save the children, follow me. How does she know about the children? Before Lily could answer, the young woman began walking to the willow. Lily tried to force herself to move, but her vision blurred again. This must be a dream. How else could she know about the children in the ice? The details of the big willow came back into focus. Then from under the willow, the fronds parted, and the young woman stopped. She picked up a knife from the lawn and cut a few fronds from the tree. Who are you? As the young woman climbed back up the trellis, Lily again saw the same young man in the black slouch hat step out from behind the willow, lift the same curtain of fronds, and revealed again The old man in the metal chair, positioned in the exact same way. Is my brain broken? Hey, Lily called out. The young man emerged from the curtain of willow fronds. Lily? I'm on the porch, she answered, still unsure of how she knew the young man, who, despite his similarities to her father, was obviously white. With fronds of willow in his hand, he trotted to the north, completely ignoring her now. Hey, she protested. Wait. Sudden pain swept over her, and she drifted back to sleep. So that's kind of just a little introduction to Lily. And what I'm doing with that one, again, besides trying to tell the historical story of, young boys being sent off to boarding schools, is kind of this fun little paranormal vibe. Because remember what I said about the 7 fires? They received prophecies of what was going to happen. So in my mind, I was like, wait, that's kind of a fun, fascinating concept. But how would this work? I don't have a DeLorean to hop into to jump back and go back in time. So what I came up with then, one of my vehicles for this is the willow tree. So this is where I'm just going to talk a little bit about the mythology of it then. Now, part of the reason why the willow tree is going to be important to me is because that's where we get dream catchers from. And so for the Anishinaabe people, the willow was considered to be a sacred tree that they would use, to make the dream catchers. And so that was kind of like my starting place for why I picked the willow tree. But as you kind of go into that, again, trying to explore the different cultures, in Norse mythology, they have the concept of a world tree that kind of connects everything. And so I was all like, yeah, this isn't just a regular willow tree, is it? And so in the concept that it connects everything, in Norse mythology, you would have like the different realms throughout the world, but you see what I'm noticing down here on the bottom? We got ourselves a big horned serpent, don't we? We'll get to the horned serpent in a little bit, but that was one of the things that I kind of liked about it, is that you had this world tree. Now, as you get farther into Norse mythology then, what day is tomorrow? The day of the week.
Wednesday.
It's Wednesday, also known as Woden's Day. And so that is the day of Odin. And so if you aren't familiar with Odin, he's heavy in our society still. But the backstory behind Odin was that in order to kind of learn the secrets of the universe, he ended up, first of all, he traded his eye to be able to see what was coming, and he was haunted by what he saw in the Well of Mimir. And so he was haunted by what he saw, so he wanted to get the answers to stop the destruction from happening. The Norse believed there was a cycle of destruction, fire and ice, fire and ice. And so Odin then sacrifices himself, and his spirit kind of goes into the tree. I was like, that's awesome too. And so me trying to put it all together then, I was like, that's kind of cool. So I like the idea of being able to find answers from within the tree. So that was one of the fundamentals. Now, if you look at like comparisons, like, pagans. Well, if you look at even what Judeo-Christian is all about, you have the whole sacrifice on the cross. And so that to me was like my main character. She's a young Christian woman. And so I wanted to be able to have things that she could relate to as well. But besides the connection between sacrifice, in both Genesis and Revelation, you have the tree of life also. The tree of life was there in the Garden of Eden from the beginning. And what was cool about it is like, nobody ever explains whatever happened to the garden. But in the book of Revelation, the end cap, you have the tree of life still there. So I was all like, ooh, wouldn't that be cool if there could be like a tree that's like been there from the beginning to the end? And so that's kind of what I'm incorporating in my story then, is that willow tree has been kind of rooted from the, so that's kind of the fun thing. Now, let me just keep going on that one. So I'm going to read another one. I told you I was going to talk a little bit about the Joseph Nicolette connection. So this is later in the story. And her, the character that motivates Lily is the mysterious Father Garrett. So he's a Jesuit priest. And he shows up and he kind of knows about her family. And he's there to understand the culture. He wants to get all the stories so he can write them down. And so she's immediately kind of like, I don't know, it's like, you're a Christian Catholic Jesuit priest, why are you interested in all this my grandpa's stuff? Like, why? It's like, well, it's important to me. And what I did then is, in the real life of Joseph Nicolet, some of his best friends were Jesuit missionaries. Pierre de Smet, for example, de Smet, South Dakota. And so I wanted to kind of keep that alive, that the knowledge that maybe they had in that one has been handed off to him. So this is where the two books kind of connect then. This is Father Guerin then explaining to Lily kind of like why he's so interested in her home. Okay, avoiding her gaze, Father Guerin sorted through his stack of books until he grabbed one and held it up. This is the private journal of Joseph Nicolet, who recorded his thoughts along with his barometric and astronomical measurements on the upper Mississippi. Listen to what Nicolet wrote. And so this is an excerpt then where he's reading. This is directly from the Nicolet Journal. Again, one of the things that inspired me. So Saturday, August 13th, 1836, Lake Manitou. We traveled only some 100 yards when a path of flowers and a garden of greenery opened before us. The surface of the water was completely concealed by the large round leaves of the white water lilies, crowned with their striking flowers, the size and brilliance of which vie with those with the grandiolari, I can't speak Latin, magnolia. A curtain of green trees bordered the left bank, protected its jagged shadows against the wide ribbon of white and green. Everyone seemed affected by this pretty landscape. Shagobay himself, in the front of the canoe I was referencing, in the front of the canoe was afraid of damaging the flowers, explaining that the roots descended into the depths. He would hold up his paddle, and the other paddlers would do the same, at the mercy of the current, and would glide lightly over the bed of greenness, leaving unharmed the yellow, white-hearted, white Coriolis, unwinding gently their flexible stems. As we entered into Lake Manitou, Shagobay began to sing, asking that our passage through the field of water lilies be invisible. So that's the real scientist right there writing about this. So I was all like, Lake Manitou it is. And so that's what I took. Now my favorite part about the Lake Manitou story is Joseph Nicolet, made a big map of Minnesota. No one could figure out where the heck he was, where he wrote about Lake Manitou. There is no lake where he describes it. So I'm all like, well, that's perfect. So that's gonna be my hometown. But regardless of it, naming it Lake Manitou, what does the word Manitou mean? It's like water spirit. And so again, he named that, water spirit lake. And then why did they lift up the paddles? Because he didn't want to wake what was underneath. And so to me, here is like France's most brilliant scientist worried about waking something in the water. So whenever I feel ridiculous with my fantasy, I was like, Joseph Nicolet was just as weird. Okay, so there we go. All right, now that of course leads me to the water serpent itself. So in Anishinaabe lore and a lot of cultures, the idea of the horned serpent is fairly prevalent. So I'll just kind of go through that mythology. Again, in Norse mythology, that was their ultimate enemy. Thor, Thor's Day's coming up. But Thor, with his mighty hammer, that was his death foe. He had to defeat the Midgard serpent. And so the horned serpent then was obviously very prevalent in Norse mythology. So there's a good villain. And if you just keep going with that, in Judeo-Christian beliefs, what do you have? You have the serpent in the garden, but then at the end, you have the red dragon. And throughout the Old Testament, you've got references to a Leviathan too. So, the idea of a horned serpent isn't totally pagan when you realize what visual imagery we get from the Bible itself. Now, that can be seen in Ocheti Sakura or Sioux beliefs. And so you kind of take a little drive around the state, which you guys need to do this summer. If you were to go out to Devil's Lake, the reason why it was called Devil's Lake is there was an old Dakota story about how there was a sea monster, a water monster that was in that. And so when the pioneers called it Devil's Lake, it was because it was like, there was something dark and sinister about it, along with its salinity. And then if you go over to the Mississippi, like Lake Pepin, that was another spot where you go there and you'll be able to find this legend about this like water monster that lives there. So again, just in Minnesota, you have a lot of references to horned serpents. And so that to me was just kind of a fun one. Now, in Anishinaabe belief, which is where Lily is kind of set, you have the story of a young boy, Ayash, who also kind of has to battle this horned serpent. So when I read those legends, I was like, great, okay, that is going to be my metaphor for evil. How real do I want the water serpent to be, though? And that was one of the things I was like, okay, is it going to be just a manifestation? Like in the book, Stephen King's It, the clown would show up and like torment the kids, but it was just like a manifestation. So I was kind of torn by how literal to make it, but I got a lake community, and Joseph Nicolet really made his guys lift the paddles, didn't they? So that to me was like, okay, I'm going to go fairly literal. So that's kind of where the horned serpent comes from in the story then. So any questions about horned serpents while we're at it, or willows? Because those are the first two. Anything we want to back around to? We've got like a few more that we'll hit on. So let's keep going then. Now, again, what I was like interested in doing is like, okay, I don't know if I want to have it be a literal monster, because then you don't have a, I don't know, it's not the ideal kind of like villain figure. So when I started to come up with that, I was like, hey, you know what would be cool is if I had some sort of like legendary figure. Like what if there was something underneath the lake, that was the source of evil. So the concept of the primordial hunter then kind of found its way into the book too. And what do I mean by the primordial hunter? Where the legend of Orion, for example, is the old school hunter. And so when people would look at the stars then, it's one of the most like obvious constellations out there. You've got the belt, you've got the legs, you've got the arms. And so people around the planet, at least Northern Hemisphere, I don't know what they do in Australia, It's like Orion, what are you talking about? But it's like the idea of the hunter then was something that, we kind of come into, whether it's Thor or Orion, they have their legends of that mighty hunter. But the same constellations then can be seen across the planet. And so this is what really was like, okay, I've got my personified villain then, because in Anishinaabe legends, they have the exact same constellation. And so the Babuniki, or the Winter Maker, was a story, he was a sorcerer. And the sorcerer collected all of the summer birds, which seems like, okay, so he likes to hunt, I get it. But the purpose in collecting all the summer birds was to keep them from migrating. And by stopping them from migrating, he's going to stop time. And all of a sudden, the seasons don't change anymore. And so the sorcerer was kind of like, his whole MO was to try to stop time. And since I was like, hey, time's kind of, the whole prophecy thing, I was like, that's kind of cool. So this would be the villain trying to keep himself from passing over. And so the Winter Maker then becomes kind of a really cool figure because he's the bringer of death, So when Orion starts to show up on the horizon, Babuniki is, kind of that signal that winter has arrived, and with winter is going to be kind of this death figure. So that to me was like, that's really cool. I kind of enjoyed that story. And of course, leaving off, what do I have left to choose from? In Judeo-Christian legends, I'd say a little bit more than just you can find in Genesis, is the idea of Nimrod, the mighty hunter. So in the Nimrod lore, the same sort of concept. He was this epic hunter that didn't want to go away. And then in Dakota folklore, we have this like really old figure called Redhorn. And so I kind of combine those. And so in my story then, I have this backstory about, the old sorcerer that's trying to do something with his magic to keep the world from passing on to the next stage. And with the Anishinaabe, their 7 fires prophecy, they've got this little caveat that says there's going to be 7 fires, but at the end of the 7th fire, mankind will have a choice. And if they choose wisely, we will have like a period of harmony. If they choose wrong, the world will be destroyed. And so I was all like, whoa, I'm jumping ahead. That's my last slide. What am I doing? Okay, all right. So anyway, so I love the idea of the Winter Maker trying to stop time. You see how, so to me that was like, that's the guy, and so he's trying to stop this from happening. And so there we go. Now, I was going to have a little excerpt, but I kind of was like, okay, I told him I'd be done at 7. But the Raven then is something that I've already written the first 3 books. And so for me, I get all excited about the Raven myths because ravens are cool. I don't know, any of you have any connections with ravens in general? Because they're super smart. They can create tools. So they're just a fascinating bird in general, but the mythology is really cool too. So in Norse mythology, you have Odin with a pair of ravens. And his ravens then are messengers, they're spies. You can see some of that in like Lord of the Rings, you know, Saruman's. But also in kind of Northern mythology, it's Celtic. But they have the concept of the Morrigan. And so in the northern beliefs then, it's either bad news that you're getting spied on by Odin, or it's like a death symbol. And so ravens would be like, ooh, that's not cool. So I had that to kind of play with. I'm like, that's nice. What else do we have though with ravens? And then I go biblical. And suddenly I was like, wait, there are good raven stories in there. And if you think about it, who was Noah's #1 bird? Okay, we're on the ark, we hit ground, let's see what's out there. He could have, picked any bird from his aviary, and he goes with the raven. And he lets the raven go, and the wild thing about it is we all know about the dove bringing back the little, but the raven didn't come back. Where'd he go? That's the little Jason Willis in me again. I was like, where did the raven go? Where did he land? Why didn't he come back to Noah? And suddenly I'm all like, oh, okay, I can play with that one later on. Okay, and so that's a fun concept. And and again, in numerous times then, instead of being a harbinger of death, the raven, for example, with Elijah, took care of him. So it was like, it wasn't as sinister as the Norse myths, where the ravens would like feed and foster. So I like that concept. And you've heard about like if his eye is on the sparrow. But there's actually a verse that Christ had also about the raven too. I was like, oh, Jesus is even giving him reps. So that was like, to me, I was like, okay, I'm definitely warming up on using the raven, because in indigenous culture then, the raven also has some key fundamentals. And so the Oceti Sakowin, they didn't trust the raven. So the Sioux were like, yeah, the raven's cool and all, but just don't trust the raven. So he's important, but he can trick you too. So he was a trickster figure. And then the Anishinaabe, and I love this one, they describe him as being the keeper of secrets. So if a raven shows up, what's its purpose? Well, from all of those, like it could be a harbinger of death, it could be there to help you, or it could be there to impart knowledge. And so in my book then, whenever you have ravens show up, how do you behave? Is this a bad day or a good day for you? And so I'm going to incorporate that idea into this series as well. Okay, moving on. Now this is probably my favorite slide because this one's fun. It's the little people myths. And this one, the more I dug into this one, the more it blew my mind how prevalent it is across the planet. We were talking about what?
Nanahunis in Hawaii.
In Hawaii, they have their version of the little people. And just share with, if you don't mind, kind of the little anecdote that you had about the sweater.
Oh, my friend's mother had some dementia, and she kept putting her wool sweaters in the dryer, and so they would come out shrunk, right? And her daughter tried to remind her all the time not to do that, and she visited her mother. Same thing happened, and the mother pulled it out and went, those damn Nanahunis are at it again.
so that was just a priceless story. And so in that regard, from Hawaii, to North America, to Europe, we have the little people story is just kind of fascinating to me. Now, I'm not talking Smurfs, nothing like that, but if you look at kind of what we have to choose from then, in northern stories, you do have a few variety of names. You have the gnomes, you have leprechauns, you have Pan. My favorite one, and this one made me scratch my head for a little while, because in William Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, the character was named Puck. Did they call him a wood nymph or something like that? I'm trying to remember the text. It was some reference to being like a wood creature, but they called him Puck. Now, the reason why I find that so fascinating is like, this little wood spirit named Puck, on the other side of the globe, the Anishinaabe had a little person called a Puck too. And so I was like, what? That's quite the coincidence that on both sides of the continent, both sides of the globe, we got little people with a Puck word that's involved. So I don't know what the Puck, that was, I just stopped, okay. So, all right, I'll be good. All right, so as we move through this then, the northern myths aren't the only ones that have little people story, but this was probably my most forced one, because I was like, okay, are there little people in the Bible? No. Okay, so there wasn't any reference like that, but what I did kind of come up with, that I kind of like Tolkien led me to it, is, if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, you've got the hobbits as the little people, but then I realized that his name for Gollum was from a Jewish story, so there was a creature called the Gollum, or the Golem, and so I was like, okay, that's not bad, and if you wanted to kind of force it in there, I was like, what is a demon that's described? You have the story about Legion and the pigs. So like, what is that all about? So in the back of my head, I was like, okay, I could maybe use that a little bit. In South Dakota then, the Oceti-Sakowin had something called the Kenoti. And so in their version of things, same with kind of the Anishinaabe, both descriptions were pretty much the same. They were these short little creatures that had like porcupine-like quills, and they'd be hiding in the woods. And kind of like what was the name again? They were considered to be pranksters. And so in Anishinaabe culture, if something goes missing, they can say, it's like, well, depending on where you're from, if you're from Minnesota, it's the Memagwisi. If you're out in like Michigan, it's the Pukwudgie. And so they had different names for it. But in some regards, they saw them as tricksters. But then there are darker stories. And the darker stories, kind of involving that one, is that they would lie in ambush. And if they saw you out there alone, they would kind of like, they would gang up on you. But then it would be more than that. You would get turned into their thrall. That you would be a puppet of them. And they'd be able to like kind of remote control you back into your village. And if you did terrible, horrible things, it was them that was in control. So I was like, wow. So suddenly I did have my loop around. It's like a demonic possession possibility. I was like, oh, okay. So that's how I'm going to define mine. All right. So moving on. By the way, isn't that an awesome sign? I think that's out in like Maine or something like that. Yeah, Pukwudgie crossing. So it's funny, but until it's not, right? Okay. Now, in the Nicolet book, and this is where kind of the series will cross over. The real French scientist kind of had on his radar something to do with alchemy, and then once I dove into it too, because I was like, why is he putting alchemy words on his map? Why is he interested in the blue earth and stuff like that? Well, when I did a kind of a deep study on alchemy, because I wasn't versed in it, the Philosopher's Stone has a legend that it's the thing that turns lead into gold, right? And so the thing that turns lead into gold, the Alchemist's Stone, has a backstory to it that this substance, if left just there, it had to be commanded to turn lead into gold. But if it was just left around, it would turn everything around it into this blue vitriol kind of substance that would turn everything into blue earth. So what is Nicolet looking for? He's looking for blue earth, okay? Because it was the calling card for the Philosopher's Stone residue. And that term goes back for like 1,000 years. At one time they called it ormus, but the word vitriol was even an acronym. Visit the interior of the earth by rectification, thou shalt find the hidden stone. And so people looking for the Philosopher's Stone, what are you looking for? Blue earth. And so, that sounds like a bunch of, hogwash. And Nicolet was a smart guy, but he was like, that's fine. But when I decided to go with it, I was like, oh, I'm going to have it be real in my stories, though. And so if Nicolet was really looking for the Philosopher's Stone, he was looking for the blue earth. And guess what he found at Lake Manitou in his real stories? In his real journal, right before we got to Lake Manitou, he described how he found this really bizarre looking blue earth And so that was like, nice, okay, so I'm gonna put the Philosopher's Stone at Lake Manitou, and my poor family, they're just gonna have to figure out what to do with it, okay? So that's where that kind of bit of fiction goes. But beyond the Philosopher's Stone, there's some fun little stories here. Nicollet was all over the death head, and so I was like, why is everybody looking for the death head? That was a mystery to me, so I'll save that one for another day, though. In Judeo-Christian lore, this is not biblical, so don't go looking in, Kings or anything like that, Kings or Chronicles. But in the backstory of Solomon, you probably are familiar from the biblical text about how Solomon fell to foreign gods at the end of his life. He began to worship, the dark gods of his wives. Well, in the story, he was tasked with building the temple of Solomon eventually. And the Mosaic law was you had to build it on unhewn stone. So the problem was, if you're going to build this great temple, but you can't carve it out of stone, how are you going to build a great temple, right? Well, the legend, again, not biblical, but the legend then is that King Solomon, in all of his wisdom, went into these foreign stories to find out if he could find something that will like dissolve or change substances, like the Philosopher's Stone would. And he created something called the shamir. So that was like, oh, that's really cool then. The shamir then was what shaped the stone without it being carved. And so I was like, that is messed up. So I love that theory. So I went with that. Now, how do I connect this very European and Middle Eastern storyline with the Northwoods of Minnesota, right? So how do I do that? And as I kind of went into that then, they're not the only ones with like a creation stone idea. So Solomon was looking for it from the days of yore because it had some sort of creative possibilities. Well, the Chetty Sakowin, and I'm not trying to just shamelessly pitch the book, but it's in this book right here. Thomas Hughes, a historian of Blue Earth County, wrote down some of the Dakota stories. And in this one, he described how Wishwe took on this monster called No Soul, who lived in a cave, and there was some shape-shifting going on, and ultimately, he was able to defeat the shape-shifting monster with this white egg. And so it was the egg that kind of like did it. So I was all like, nice, that's a pretty cool story. But in Anishinaabe lore, there was another fun one, is they had a story about their water drum. And to this day, if you go to, a ceremony, there will be certain Mede, Medewiwen, who will have the water drum, and it's like a religious symbol. But the backstory is that there once was an original water drum, and the original water drum is what brought about creation. So they're like, it's like having a cross as a Christian. You're honoring that backstory. So they have the water drum still, but in the fun story of the Seven Fires prophecy, they lost something along the way. So remember how they started off in Nova Scotia and they're going across the continent? Well, the prophecy said that once they reach their promised land, they will realize that their assumptions were wrong. And then in the time of the seventh fire, they would have to retrace their steps in order to find what they lost along the way. And so literally, there are some things that had been lost. One of them was the Ironwood Scrolls, the explanation of the original tale, because their oral tradition is wrong, they said. But you'll be able to find the original one buried in a cave. Wait, didn't I just talk about a cave? Okay, so that was kind of fun. And then they have something called the Sacred Shell, too, that in order for you to be ready for that final fight against evil, you need to make sure you have the Sacred Shell. So I was all like, oh, that's kind of some fun carry. Now, I'm going to kind of wrap things up then. Ultimately then, this is going to be leading to that concept that I had in the Seven Fires. Because at the end of the seventh fire, what did the Anishinaabe write? Well, there's going to be a choice. And so when I looked at that then, from both the afterlife concepts of what is immortality, and I'm kind of putting it on high gear here because I promised you guys 7, and so I'll kind of wrap that things up. So part of what I wanted to have kind of just underlying in the story then is what is a ghost? how does a ghost work? Because, if you have things like heaven or hell and that sort of stuff, what happened with a ghost? Because when you look at some of the afterlife concepts, and so if I'm going to have a haunted lake, I need to have a reason for it to be haunted. You see, because if you look at the belief system, in Norse mythology, for example, you've got Hel herself. So you're going to see her in a couple books coming up. But Hel then was like the keeper of the underworld, and that's nice. But in Greek mythology, you would have the river that would lead you to the underworld. Are you familiar with the river Styx? Okay, so I was like, okay, that's cool. So you've got a river and an underworld kind of concept. In Judeo-Christian concept, then it's been a little simplified, but if you dig into it, you'll have things like Jacob's ladder, the concept of up with heaven, but then you'll also have the concept of hell being down. Now, being a mythology guy, where'd you get the word hell from? That's like, okay, that's hell. Okay, so it's like, so what was the word? And the word was Sheol, and the descriptions of Sheol, that's mostly Old Testament, is that it's kind of a down place, but it's a watery place too. So that was like, cool. So we got water and water. You know where I want to go with water, right? Because like, where's my my story's happening at a haunted lake, okay? So I was like, water and water. And then it got a little richer for me, and when I kind of went into what the indigenous cultures had. So the Oceti-Sakowin had something that was just fascinating to me. I can go on about this one for a while. The first thing that was cool is the Big Dipper. The Big Dipper became kind of a representation of the 7 council fires, the Oceti-Sakowin, symbolizing them. Because if you look at the shape of the Big Dipper, you've got Minnesota right here, where you've got the Sisseton, the Metawakiton, the Warpakudi, and the, what did I say? Warpaton, Wapakudi, Sisseton, and Metawakiton. Okay, I said 4. And so that's Minnesota. And then what do you see from the rest of it? It goes out to the Yankton tribe, the Yanktonai tribe, and then way out in West River, you have the Lakota. So the shape of it represents their nation at its height. So I was like, that's cool. But in concept, they referred to her as Tunwin, the best spelling pronunciation I can do on that one. And so Tunwin was the blue woman. Now I say that because I had to wonder why Joseph Nicolet put the word Undine on his map of Minnesota. Because Undine is the water element. It's also a mermaid story. So the blue woman being put right in the middle of Dakota territory was kind of like, wow, I don't know what Joseph Nicolet's doing with that, but we've got a blue woman here, don't we? And so that's the legend of the blue woman. And the Anishinaabe, their afterlife belief system, then was based off of a river as well. So instead of it being blue, like water, you would have the concept that the Milky Way was the river of souls. And in order for your soul to pass on to the afterlife, it would line up with something called, we refer to it as the Pleiades, but this is kind of that little hole in the heavens, the hole in the day, that's where it would take you. So I don't know, those are just some really fun connections, but what I loved about all of them is the water connections between all of them. So that became important in my story. And the last one, for those of you like, when can I get out of here? The last one that we have then, since this was a countdown to the 7 fires, and if I was to go way back to that 7 fire slide, remember I had like the Halley's Comet one, where I kind of did the count up? Well, that to me was like, when I started to look at that, I was like, okay, so if each era matches up, I almost want to go back there, each era matches up with the return of Halley's Comet. And the 7th fire begins in 1986. When does Halley's Comet come back? Well, I can tell you who knows that answer. Isaac Newton did. The reason why I bring that one up, because to the Anishinaabe, at the end of the 7th fire, we're going to have a choice, aren't we? A choice is either going to bring about an extra time period, and we'll live in harmony and peace, or it's going to bring about total destruction. And there's going to be a young boy that's gonna be responsible for the choice. I was like, nice, okay, I can do that. Okay, I've got his heritage, I'll figure it out. And so that's fine, but when you look at it, I don't want to have a story where it's going to be in a big epic, kind of like, like Norse mythology, gods and giants and stuff like that, fighting it out. So I didn't like the idea of there being a big battle in my book. But I did like the idea of, remember when Odin sacrificed himself on the tree? Because he realized they were stuck in a time loop, kind of. And the only way to get out of it was to sacrifice himself so he could get the answers to get out of it. So I was like, wouldn't that be cool if I could incorporate that time loop a little bit? But the part that I really got excited about was that Isaac Newton once predicted the end of the world. The smartest man in Europe and maybe on the planet at the time, he went to his calculator and he was like, when the world's going to come to an end? July 4th, 2061, said Isaac. Now, when's Halley's Comet coming back? And that's when all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I'm going to go with the Halley's Comet time period. And that, I'm sorry for freaking anybody out, but again, I'm having fun, okay? But I was all like, that's really cool then. So, because what's he, he's an expert on Halley's Comet too. So I was all like, oh, that's really cool. Kind of disturbing, but kind of cool. So that to me lined up. So Newton's prediction and the Anishinaabe prediction was like, nice, we're all aligned. Okay. Now, as we kind of continue through this, I just wanted to share. I mean, if you look at the kind of some of the symbols for the end times, we have dragon, right? And again, that connects right back to the horned serpent. The Ocheti Sakowin, some of the things they have, you might be familiar with the ghost dance, but some of the more obscure one is they said there's going to be the black snake that's coming. So that's something that they have in their stories. And then, of course, you have the Anishinaabe with kind of their 7 fires prophecy. And I just love how all that stuff kind of lined up. All right, well, I'm going to click to the last one here, and we'll just kind of, I'm sorry, one last thing. This is just the visual representation of it. So there's 7 time periods then. Again, that boy, I had a little picture of just an artistic rendition of it. They believe then that this boy has to retrace the steps. And what does that mean? He's going to figure out what went wrong with the 7 fires prophecy. So for me, I just think it's kind of fun looking at it just because I'm like, okay, that's potentially really cool because the way they describe it then, it's like, here is the Christian Armageddon concept, and here is kind of the Christian paradise concept. And so it's kind of like, wow, that's kind of a fascinating thing to put in your brain. So there is kind of an explanation of kind of the mythology that kind of went into this series. Again, book 1 is kind of that starting at the basics, So we're just going to meet Lily. And what she kind of struggles with then are her traditional beliefs versus her newfound Christianity. But my series then, what I'm going to have is kind of that ticking of the clock, that, there she is back in, what is that, the 5th fire is where this one starts, and she's going to start to see things kind of start ticking down. And so the readers are going to go with her on that journey. The readers are going to start back in the 5th fire. And the whole family story then, her family, will take it from that book 1 all the way to 2061. Because here I am writing, in 2022, and I'm like, hey, that's not that far away. I can kind of like imagine what that's going to be like. So as my series kind of progresses, by the time we get to book 7, we'll be talking about that 8th fire coming up. So that's been kind of the story in a nutshell. I threw a lot at you. You got your money's worth. If I got paid by the word, I'd be a rich man. So, okay. Is there anything you wanted to double back and just talk about, or just writing in general?
What are your time frames? Had you going till 8 o'clock?
Oh, okay. Well, I can keep going then. So, no, because again, it's like, my wife knows this, like, oh, you're going to have a group full of people that just want to hear you talk about this stuff. And so it's like, yeah, take as long as you want. So, if there's anything you wanted me to go back on or just talk about in general, yes, go ahead.
When the water keepers were trying to keep the pipeline out of South Dakota, they were referring to that as the black snake.
Exactly, and so that was something that freaked them out, you know, because it was like, wow, this is just like we were warned about. And so the Dakota Access Pipeline, you know, the metaphor of oil and black and it snaking through, that definitely was something that was on the radar. So I'm glad you picked up on that one, because that's when I came across it. And I was like, what's this black snake thing? And it was fascinating to me to kind of see that connection too. So very good, yes. And that could be, you know, if you look at it, you know, like, it could be an environmental call. You know, what is the young boy supposed to do? I don't have any good answers, you know. All I read was that he's gonna have a choice, you know. What does that mean? Who knows? But it could be something environmental. Nice. All right, anything else just to double back to or ask more about?
You have a fascinating mind.
Well, where did I start? It's like that first one, you know, where when I made the mashup. That was my warning to you all. It's like, you know, it's like when I was in 4th grade, I mashed up, you know, the Odyssey, and yeah, where was that one? That one. Yeah, that one right there. That was like the harbinger of things to come, right? So, all right. Anything else then that I can just kind of delve into or talk to you about? No. Got enough to think about for the rest of the week, thank you. And again, you know, part of my problem was I was trying to just preview some of this. You know, the book series, they'll take its time with that. You know, you saw it in the excerpt that I read. You know, Lily's just starting to wonder what's up with the willow tree. You know, and the same thing, like, what's up with, like, the water? You know, why was my grandpa so freaked out about, you know, the lilies? You know, she was named after the lilies, and so.
So your books, your subsequent books are going to, this is gonna carry on then?
Yeah, absolutely,
Lily
yeah,
and
right,
with
and
the
so,
progression?
I'll just, we'll get to that, there's the one. So if you look at that then, the fire handler, through the soul catcher, the first book is 1898. The Winter Maker then has a big jump to 1961 and 2. The Trickster is 1986, because that's Halley's Comet. And so that's when it came in 1986. And then it kind of will continue. The Summer Bird, that'll be in like the late 90s. The Pathfinder is about 2003. The Thunderbird, I think it's like right after that, I think 2009 to 10-ish. And then the Soul Catcher, that's going to be the one that's the most contemporary. So I'll be writing that one kind of in the present whenever I get to that one, where they're going to, they'll be talking to that darn willow tree. And the willow tree is going to be explaining things and that sort of stuff. So that'll be like the 7 books. But I'm not actually going to set it in 2061, because I don't want to have to like picture what that was going to be. So all they're going to do is, you know, remember how I said like Norse mythology and Odin was kind of that time loop thing? So my characters are going to realize they're in kind of a time loop of sorts, because how did the 7 fires begin? Prophets from the future reached back and told them what was going to happen to them over the next 7 fires. And so where am I going to take the story? I'm going to take the story from the beginning in Nova Scotia, and where do I bring it to? The end, you know, at the end of the 7th fire. But what does that do? That has to then loop back, doesn't it? And that's where the Dreamcatcher concept, what is the Dreamcatcher? It's a loop. And so, you know, is it fate, you know, free will, all that sort of fun stuff? So that's where the loop concept will come in. And the choice is going to be what to do with that knowledge. You know, if you know you have to go back, do you go back? Do you tell them? Do you not tell them? That's kind of the big moral dilemma. Why am I spoiling the whole series?
Are you done with book 3 yet?
Yeah, book 3 is written. I'm just waiting in line.
It's not being published yet?
No, that one, it's in line. Book 2 is being worked on right now by my editor, who's ironically named Raven. Can you believe that? I got a book editor named Raven. I was like, yes, thank you. Okay, there was nothing symbolic about Chelsea, you know, but Raven was symbolic. I loved it. So I was like, yes, give me Raven. I feel good about that. And so book 3 I've written, and so that one's going to be, it's just waiting in line. So the Winter Maker will be next year. No, I'm sorry, the Winter Maker will be 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. Okay, so the Soul Catcher is going to be set in 2028. So I figured that part out. So.
I thought dream catchers where you hung them in your window And they kept the bad dreams out.
Okay, let's talk about dream catchers. All right, so the first thing to know about dream catchers is in the mythology of it, they were created by Grandmother Spider. And so Grandmother Spider then, who is kind of a semi creation type god, so Grandmother Spider goes way back to the beginning. So in the earliest stories, they had a Grandmother Spider there. But what she did with that then is the willow branch. Let me just show you one real quick. Where's that at? Is that coming up? Okay. Right there. So the willow branch then, this is classic Anishinaabe dream catcher. The more contemporary dream catchers, are like, are the little loops like this, right?
Yeah.
But the cool thing about this then is this not only comes from the willow, but you have the thick end and the thin end. So the thick end is like the past, and then the thin end is the present or future. And so what I loved about the concept then is that's the intersecting point, isn't it? So that's where it crosses over the past and the future as a crossover point. And so that's what I love for the style of the old dream catcher. And then what it does is the webbing keeps evil spirits from entering. And the primary use for it is if there was a death nearby, they would have the dream catcher to keep the spirit of the deceased from traveling into a newborn. So they would especially use that in that sort of situation. Now, in a broader sense then, it was a dreams concept. And so it would keep the bad dreams out, and the hole in the middle would allow the good dreams to go through. And so that's kind of the other context for it. So there's some mythology on the
With the
dream catcher.
feathers.
Oh, I don't have a good answer for that. But
Okay.
depending on the type of feather, has some variation on use. So, yeah. Again, I'm only an expert in what I need to use for the books. So everything else I forget about, All right. Anything else you just wanted to pry away at?
You were referencing, the seven, if there was other cultures where they had their versions of the seven.
Yeah, I mean, seven's like, just the mythology and magnificence of the seven concepts. And so that's what hooked me right away, because you can tell as a fourth grader I was already comfortable with the book of Revelation, the fact that I had my little story set in Patmos. But so the sevens that are in the book of Revelation, when I came across an end times prophecy dealing with sevens, I was all like, oh, I've got to check this one out. And so that's what kind of drew me for that. So yeah, the parallels of sevens, of course, are important. And that's why I wanted, of course, to have a 7-book series, just to honor that.
And age 7 is the age of reason.
I said, have you come up front? You're going to impart some all sorts of knowledge here, yeah. So excellent. All right, well, again, since we're going to kind of wrap things up because I put a lot of words out there, I do have the books available if you think you could find the right present for somebody. We've got Christmas coming up. The 3 books that I have then, I've got the Fire Handler, which is primarily what we talked about. I've got that paperback for $20. I can do cash or card. I've got Tales of the Blue Earth, which is what piqued my interest. A lot of those legends and lore, just the raw stories, without there being a plot. That's just like 20 little pieces of things. So I have that paperback for 10 and hardcover for 15. And then I've got the Joseph Nicolette story, which I kind of see that one as a kickoff that could lead into the other one too. So in the Fire Handler, as you heard me read, they reference Joseph Nicolette. But if you know what Joseph Nicolette was about, that would be a good bridge kind of book too. So. All right, well, I thank you for being along. I hope I gave you a few things to think about.
Yeah.